Welcome to video 3 of this contribution to the liberal arts module. I will talk about architectural fragility in this video, and in particular how shocks might affect the global economy. And of course I will focus on the specific architectural features of the global economy at this time, so the contemporary global economy. And as discussed, this is a platform economy. So it will all be about the control of supply chains and the effects of shocks on platforms. So let's first recap a little bit about the architectural features of our contemporary global economy. And then we see that we can identify how shocks might affect the wealth creation processes that happen in this global economy. And it is really about the fragility of the architecture. And there are two forms of architectural fragility, and those are related to the main two parts of the architecture, namely institutions and trade networks. So the architecture of the institutions and the architecture of the trade networks, they both affect how the economy is doing with regard to responding to shocks and how shocks might impact the economy. The institutions are the rules that govern the interactions that happen on the networks in the economy, the trade networks, the production networks. When a shock happens, what is happening to those institutions, and will those institutions amplify the shock, or will they absorb the shock or helping to absorb the shock? And we can call that susceptibility of the institutions. And then the second element is how the trade network architecture, the design of the trade network, deals with shocks. And that refers to the vulnerability of these trade networks. How do shocks affect the trade network? If bankruptcy is affecting some parts of the network, how does the network recover? Will it be a major disruption or a minor disruption? And the more complex the network is, the more the disruption might be major, so to say. I will talk about these elements separately. So first I will talk about the institutions. So the rules and the arrangements that are made with regard to how we interact, how are those affected by shocks? What will happen to these shocks from an institutional point of view? Are these institutions helping to alleviate the shock, or are they amplifying the shock? That's the main question. And the main example of a completed shock, something that happened in the past and that played out, so to say, is of course the financial crisis of 2007-2008. I would like to refer to that as the Great Panic of 2008. It was a major financial panic in the financial system, and it brought down the financial system nearly completely. It froze up all capital markets, and there were no loans made anymore between banks at some point in this enormous collapse. And what happened there is that the institutions directly contributed to this panic. How contracts were written in the American mortgage market, for example, completely affected how the shock played out. So the shock happened in the housing market in the United States. Prices of houses dropped in 2007 very significantly because they were overpriced. So there was a housing bubble, as we can call that. And that bubble was corrected. However, the drop in the prices of the housing undermined the mortgages that were written. And so the institutions that were at play before the collapse in 2007 of the housing market affected the consequences. So bursting of the bubble in 2007 triggered a financial panic in the mortgage market. And suddenly all these banks realized that all these mortgages were very susceptible. And they wanted to pull those mortgages essentially. And nobody wanted to buy these mortgages anymore on the capital markets where they were financed. And this triggered then a total collapse of the financial system in 2008. So what we see here is a system of institutions that really amplifies the effects of a shock. So the shock was the bursting of the bubble in the housing market, and that triggered the total collapse of the financial system, mainly also because of the rules under which all kinds of financial deals were made. And this included all kinds of innovative financial products that turned out to be very, very fragile, so to say, very susceptible to these shocks. And so these institutions might very much increase the vulnerability of networks and might lead to the collapse of networks, which happened in 2008, in particular in the financial networks. The opposite can also happen, of course, but at the moment our institutions look extremely fragile, and that is mainly because of the neoliberal ideology that underwrites these institutions. We have set up our rules, our institutions, from a neoliberal perspective. And this neoliberal perspective is the strong belief in private initiative and private action. And so there is no belief in the collective good, in the public overall objective of the economy. So these institutions are not set up to deal with shocks to the collective system of the global economy. On top of that, the platform economy is all about outsourcing. And so these platforms, which are the main carriers of the economy, have no expertise. Because they outsource everything, there is no expertise in the platform itself. And when one of the entities to which it is outsourced is affected by a shock, there is no way that the platform itself can deal with that, because there is no knowledge. So outsourcing leads to incompetence. And this is mainly shown with regard to governments. Governments have become platforms and a lot of things are outsourced. And when you look at the UK government, how it is dealing with the spread of the virus, it is rather incompetent. And that is because everything is outsourced. So when we talk about, for example, the testing and the track and trace system based on testing, that is not really functioning very well. It is because the UK government essentially outsourced that to other platforms like Serco and G4S. Serco and G4S are both also platform companies. They're transnational corporations, and they outsource that again. And they hire knowledgeable gig workers, so to say. They hire for services people to take care of the testing and the tracing, so to say. But that is not necessarily a great success. Incompetence is built into the system because everything is based on those platforms. That brings me then to the second element of the contemporary global economy, and that is the networks themselves. These networks are focused on the platforms in these supply chains, and the platforms are not the greatest architectural designs to deal with shocks, to say the least. So, first of all, the platform architecture leads to a lengthening of the global supply chains. There are great gains to be made with longer supply chains, and all of them are susceptible to or very, very vulnerable to shocks. Close related to this is that all these platforms occupy middleman positions, and they position themselves in such a way that they can control the supply chains. So when we look at Amazon, it completely controls the supply chains that it is part of. And that is extremely profitable. However, there's a dark side to that, and that is that if you have an outage related to Amazon, if Amazon's operations are affected, the whole supply chain comes to a standstill. And there are no alternative pathways in the global economy to take care of things. The platform architecture of our global supply chains, our global production networks, are particularly vulnerable to shocks. To dwell a little bit longer on this, the longer the supply chains are, the more trades are made along the chain, and the more vulnerable it all becomes. This can be called thin supply chains, of course. And a typical example is this. Here you see a single line made up of 3 entities that trade with each other. So the red entity makes a product that is traded to the green entity that uses the product as an input to produce their own output, which is then traded on to the blue node. So this is a typical thin supply chain, and of course the green node is very powerful because it sits in the middle. It is a typical middleman, and it can control the supply chain completely and can reap tremendous benefits from that control. If you have a distributed supply chain, like this picture on the right, also called a thick supply chain, there are no middlemen. And when you take out a green node, it will not very much affect the functionality of this economy. However, when you look at the left thin supply chain, taking out the green node completely breaks the chain and completely brings it to a standstill. That is certainly not the case in this thick supply chain. So the network architecture is extremely important, and that is illustrated here with those 2 pictures. Now, middlemen are very vulnerable, but middlemen are very powerful, and the result of that power is profits, and this will not go away very quickly. Our supply chains will remain vulnerable because these middlemen will remain in existence. And if these middlemen fail, then we have a total collapse of the supply chains. Of course, the auxiliary parties to the supply chain suffer tremendously. So all the gig workers and all the firms that supply inputs to the platform and all the clients of the platform, they all suffer significantly. Think of having an interruption of your internet. Suddenly you cannot do a single thing anymore, and even when you pay tremendous amounts every month to your internet provider like BT or TalkTalk or whatever it is, you are affected by these interruptions. The conclusion is middleman failure can lead to catastrophic failure in the supply chain and can affect the global economy tremendously. Right? So, and the thinness of the supply chains enhances this. Let's focus now on the COVID crisis. We have seen 2 forms of shocks being imposed on the global economy. And the first one was that of the mandated shutdown. Many governments, not only in the West but also in the East, mandated complete shutdowns of national economies or local economies. In China, it was mainly shutting down the local economy. In the West, it was mainly shutting down the whole national economies. This is like turning off an engine and trying to restart it again after it has cooled off. And it is all a question whether you can get it going again. That is the same here with the economy. You shut down all the supply chains, and then a little bit later you try to restart everything and get everything back working again. And that is exactly what you see in the response of the UK government. They try to get everybody back into the pub, into work, doing the rush hour thing again, going back to the office. All that stuff is back on the table. However, people are very reluctant, and now of course we're hit with the second wave, and again there are local shutdowns now instead of a national shutdown. But nevertheless, it is very hard to get the economy going again. When you shut down a supply chain, it is very hard to get that going again. The second thing is that what happened was sectoral impacts. So, certain sectors, certain supply chains in the economy were much more affected than others. And here I'm talking about the kind of luxury goods that we are consuming. And we do that a lot. There's a significant consumption of luxury goods. I'm talking about traveling, having vacations, and this has been affected a lot by the COVID crisis. Similarly, food services, restaurants and pubs have been affected a lot. They have been mandated to shut down completely. And arts and leisure are still completely shut down as I speak. Those are very much affected sectors in the economy, and those supply chains have been completely shut down and completely affected. And it is not clear whether they will be able to recover after they are allowed to go back into service. What is hit on one side is of course affecting another side. For example, if you're not allowed to go to restaurants and pubs, well, what do? You try to get your stuff in a different way, and then you see that the retail industry of food and drink has a tremendous upturn in this crisis. We consume much more at home these foods and drinks, and of course the supermarkets are doing very, very well during this crisis. Anyway, both forms impact the economy quite differently. So when you talk about mandated shutdowns, it is a total shutdown of all the main supply chains. When you talk about sectoral impacts, we are looking at a different type of shutdown, and we talk about more the shocks that I was referring to. That is when you take out a certain part of the economy, and then it is very hard to see how that is recovering, given also our susceptible institutions and vulnerable trade network architectures. To recap, mandated shutdowns very much affect the economy as a whole, and it is a big question whether a proper restart can be happening, and it is related to the susceptibility of institutions very much. It is our institutions that determine whether you can get things going again. And I already pointed out, those institutions, the neoliberal institutions on which our economy is based, are very susceptible. Outsourcing is not a great model to be dealing with total shutdowns or restarting economies after a total shutdown. When we talk about those sectoral impacts, those sectors in the economy that are most affected, the travel industry, the restaurants and pubs, those kind of industries, then it is all about the network architecture. If you take out a certain part of the supply chain, how will it affect the total functionality of the economy? And the news might be quite bad with regard to this. A lot of people might become unemployed related to this sectoral impacts, and this is directly coming from the architecture of the trade networks. It is not so much the institutions that are foremost at play here, but it is the design of our supply chains. What is the response? The response has been to prop up certain supply chains by targeted subsidies. And I'm referring here, for example, to the UK government subsidizing meals in the month of August to get the restaurant supply chains functioning again. So there was a subsidy issued to get people back into restaurants and to restart this supply chain that was so much affected. Of course, those subsidies have been withdrawn now, and there will be a second wave, and that might result again into tremendous problems. There is a long-term consequence of this, and that is the entities that are directing the supply chains very much want to be more resilient. Resilience of supply chains and production networks is the key word now. This will be a target for future endeavor, so to say. There will be research carried out to make supply chains more resilient. This concludes my contribution to this module. I hope you got a good idea of how a crisis like the COVID crisis affects the global economy, and that it directly impacts the architecture of that economy. It impacts on the trade network as well as the institutions, and that these institutions can amplify the crisis or accommodate or reduce the impact of the crisis. And it's hopefully clear that we live in an age in which this is not clear at all, that we will weather this crisis safely, because the economy is not well structured and that there are severe problems with regard to this architecture of our global economy. If you want to know more, I have uploaded several readings and provided links to several videos from YouTube in which there is a debate of the structure of the economy and how it is affected by the COVID crisis. Also, I have provided a link to the library of a book that I wrote on how economic wealth is generated through a social division of labor. And so this is all about the structure of the economy and how economic wealth is created. Hopefully, you've enjoyed this and you learned also quite a bit about how the economy is affected. Thank you.